Hello, everyone, and welcome to another lecture here today. We are going to be talking about coronary blood flow, or blood flow to the heart, during acute and dynamic exercise. So this should be a relatively short lecture. You can see on this page here the learning objectives for today. One, to understand the relationship between the cardiac pumping, the metabolic cost, and the blood flow to the coronary muscle. Especially during exercise, because the heart is responsible for supplying all of that blood, all of that oxygen, not only during rest, but during exercise. And so when our blood flow demand and our oxygen demand goes up during exercise, well, so does the metabolic cost of the heart, and therefore we're going to need to get more blood flow to the heart itself. We're going to understand the determinants of myocardial oxygen consumption and blood flow, and also understand the regulation of myocardial blood flow during acute and dynamic exercise. So cardiac output is what the heart is actually producing. That is heart rate and stroke volume, and that will tell you how many liters of blood per minute that the heart is ejecting out and how much arterial blood the heart is supplying to the rest of the body. And the heart is going to be responsible for all of the blood flow within our body, right? So as we go from rest to light intensity exercise to moderate intensity, all the way up to strenuous and max intensity exercise, that cardiac output is going to increase because we need to supply more oxygen and therefore more blood flow to the rest of the body. So as the heart produces more, as you could see by the graph here, well then obviously the amount of metabolism, the amount of work that it is going under during those intensities of exercise is also going to increase, right? So the heart is the only organ that's going to provide its own perfusion pressure for its own blood flow. Remember, blood flow is going to be determined by the starting pressure and then the ending pressure. So the heart's responsible for creating that starting pressure for the entire body, and in addition to that, it's responsible for supplying that pressure for itself as well. And so when you increase the amount of times and the force that it's going to contract with, right, that's going to increase the metabolic cost. So as heart rate increases, as stroke volume increases with exercise, so is the amount of oxygen that those myocytes, that those cardiac muscle cells are going to need to take up. And so more blood flow to active skeletal muscle requires an increase in coronary blood flow. So since our skeletal muscles are working harder, so does our heart, and both need more blood flow during this physical activity. Just some quick factoids here about the heart. It weighs around 300 grams, relatively small, around the size of your fist, but its cardiac muscle tissue is highly aerobic. It has a lot of mitochondria, and think about it, it beats just about every second from when you're in the womb till the day you die. So it's highly endurance, right? It has a lot of endurance. It has to beat every single second, and so we know that muscle fibers that are more for endurance are going to be more aerobic as far as metabolism is concerned. So you're going to need a lot of blood flow to those cardiac muscle cells. And so the heart has 3,000 to 4,000 capillaries per millimeter square. And when you compare that to skeletal muscles, that's, skeletal muscle is going to have roughly 300 to 500 capillaries. So much more blood pathways, much more capillaries to supply that oxygen to that working cardiac tissue. And that also makes the diffusion distance, since you have more blood pathways, more blood vessel area that is interacting with more area of the cardiac tissue, that diffusion distance is much smaller in the heart. And so here's the heart. Here's the anatomy and overview. As we know, blood is going to be pumped out of this left ventricle through the aorta. And now the blood, the arterial blood that goes into the aorta, is supplied out to the arterioles and gets sent out to the rest of the body, right? But what we're going to have here branching off from the aorta is cardiac arteries. And these are going to be the arteries responsible for supplying that coronary blood flow to the muscle cells and the cells overall of the heart. And then once the oxygen's picked up, once the CO2 is dumped off from those metabolic reactions, and then all the waste products are dumped off, these veins are going to go right back up and then dump off that deoxygenated blood into the right side of the heart, right? So constantly we are pumping blood out of the heart, and since the heart is responsible for creating its own perfusion pressure, whatever it pumps out, a percentage of that, roughly 5% at rest, is going to be pumped into the heart for that metabolic exchange. So here we see the delivery of blood flow at the different stages of the heart, right? So again, the heart itself is the only one that's going to create its own pressure to drive its own blood flow, right? And what happens is that here again, we're looking at pressure. And so this is, going to be this period right here when aortic pressure builds up. This is going to be systole, right? And so we're looking at diastole, where it's going down, the period right before systole, and then the heart's going to contract and eject out blood, and then another period of diastole where pressure decreases, right? So now that you see here, this bar is systole and here is diastole, you're able to tell that when you look at the left coronary artery, which is going to supply the blood flow to the left side of the heart, and that's going to be where the left ventricle is, which is supplying blood flow out to the rest of the body. You see that most of that blood flow, right, occurs right in the beginning of diastole, right after that systolic period. Here you see, you get a little bit more towards the right side during systole, but when you compare the actual numbers, the milliliters of how much blood the heart's receiving, most of that blood flow comes during diastole, and that's a very, very important point, that 70 to 80% of the coronary perfusion occurs during diastole, right? So that period of relaxation is when the heart gets most of its blood and therefore most of its oxygen supply. But this creates a problem, because during exercise, the output of the heart goes up. And so that's an increase in stroke volume, and that's an increase in heart rate. And so maximal blood flow to the left ventricles during diastole, the problem is that during exercise, this diastole period, right, this series of the heart, this cardiac phase here, gets shorter. As we want to increase heart rate, that period of relaxation becomes less and less and less. So therefore, the filling time of the heart, its blood flow supply, is going to get cut off. So when you go from rest and you have this period of diastole, let's say your resting heart rate is 60 beats per minute, and then you go up to 120 beats per minute, well, this time that you are going to get to supply the heart, supply that cardiac tissue with oxygen, is going to be cut in half. So that's going to create a problem, because the metabolic demand, the work that the heart is producing, is going up. But the time it receives that blood flow, that diastole period, is being cut in half. So therefore, its oxygen and its blood supply is going to be cut short. So this creates a potential problem, because we need that blood flow and that oxygen flow to the cardiac tissue to go up, right? So how does our body sort of overcome this? How does our body overcome the fact that our period that we're supplying blood to the heart during exercise has now decreased? And so let's talk a little bit more before we address that. So how does the body overcome that? Let's talk about coronary blood flow a little bit more. There's no true resting value, as we say. We could estimate it based on animal studies, but since, finding this value in humans would be very invasive, we have to take our best guess, right? So we estimate a resting value based on 60 to 70 beats per minute, which is the average for most people, right? So if you say that 60 to 80 milliliters per minute per 100 grams of ventricular mass, and the VO2 of the heart is roughly 7 to 9 milliliters of oxygen per 100 grams per minute. Total coronary blood flow is roughly around 250 milliliters per minute. And so the resting cardiac output for the heart is roughly 5%. So it receives 5% of its own output, a relatively small amount overall. At rest, oxygen extraction is 60 to 70% of the cardiac muscle. So it's near maximal even at rest. And so this max for AVO2 can be, sometimes 16, 17, 18 milliliters per 100 milliliters of blood. So here lies the problem. Because, again, when you talk about VO2, that could be regional. It doesn't have to be overall. So we could look at VO2 in a sense of how much is this organ, how much consumption of oxygen is this organ taking up. And so during exercise, again, the work of the heart is going up. So its VO2, the amount of oxygen that it's going to consume, is going to go up. But we have the problem that blood flow is going to be challenged due to that shorter diastolic period, because heart rate is increasing so much that it cuts off that blood flow. So you could say, well, if we want to increase VO2 and the formula is cardiac output or blood flow times AVO2 difference, well, why don't you just increase the oxygen extraction? And again, this presents another problem now. Well, we can't really increase VO2 that much in cardiac muscle tissue because its oxygen extraction is already maximal, right? Even at rest. So there's a very limited amount of growth that you could get as far as the AVO2 difference is concerned. You can't really make up a lot of that VO2 just by increasing oxygen extraction, right? So there's a minimal increase in oxygen extraction with increasing VO2 in the heart. And so this means that the VO2 of the heart is called flow limited, right? This is what we call it, that the VO2 is flow limited, meaning that it relies almost entirely on an increase in blood flow to that cardiac muscle tissue. And so we have a problem. The diastolic filling time is cut short. AVO2 difference is already high. So how do we increase that VO2? If it's going to rely on blood flow, how are we going to release more blood flow into that circulation? And so, the more metabolic activity the heart has, the harder it's going to work, the more blood it pumps out, the more blood flow that's going to need. And so since we have a decrease in O2 supply to O2 delivery ratio, because again, that time is cut short. So now the heart's working harder, its demand is going up, and it's not having the supply to reach that demand. And so what happens because of this is that we get a release of a vasodilator substance called nitric oxide. And so you've probably heard of this before. It's a supplement that companies sell. But in our bodies, nitric oxide promotes vasodilation and then promotes blood flow because of that, right? So since that vasodilation is going on, those arteries are going to increase their radius. And so that decreases resistance and therefore is going to increase blood flow. So that is basically the solution to our problem during exercise. So to lay this out clearly just one more time, the heart has to work harder during exercise to supply more blood flow. So therefore, we need more blood flow to the muscle cells of the heart. The VO2, the amount of oxygen that the heart is going to consume, is going to depend on, again, blood flow, cardiac output, and AVO2 difference. The problem is AVO2 difference is already high, so you can't really get that much more oxygen extraction from the cardiac myocytes. And heart rate is going up. So now that blood flow, that diastolic filling time has decreased. And so what's the solution? How do we get more blood flow to the coronary circulation? It's this nitric oxide, the vasodilator substances that get released as a consequence of the mismatch between O2 demand and O2 supply. But this is going to help then increase the flow to that cardiac muscle tissue, and then the O2 consumption, the VO2 of the heart, can then go up. So again, we say the O2 supply to the cardiac muscle is flow limited because the O2 extraction is already close to maximal. And so we see here, though, that as we exercise and as the output of the heart goes up, we are able to deliver more coronary blood flow to the muscle tissue, and that's going to help increase the amount of oxygen consumption the heart is going to have, right? And again, just an overview of the problem, that with increases in heart rate, we have a reduction in diastolic filling time, which means the increased time spent in systole comes with a restriction in coronary blood flow. And so this is overridden by those vasodilator substances, and coronary vessels will vasodilate in response to reduced O2 supply demand ratio. And so this release of nitric oxide and vasodilator metabolites is going to help increase coronary blood flow overall. And so then, if we talk about limits to VO2 max, well, VO2 max, just like VO2 at any point, if we're talking about the whole entire body, is limited by cardiac output. And so if you're not able to supply the proper amount of blood flow and the proper amount of oxygen to the heart, well, it's going to have an inability to raise its cardiac output. It's not going to match the work needed with the metabolism, with the energy in order to produce that cardiac output, right? And again, stroke volume is a primary limitation to VO2 maximum. So the heart itself, that is the limitation to VO2. If you're not able to pump out enough blood, if you're not able to meet the metabolic demands of those cardiac myocytes, it's going to limit your VO2 maximum, because the heart is what's going to be supplying the blood flow in order for your skeletal muscles to consume that oxygen. And so it is hard to, again, measure coronary blood flow, using certain technologies. We can measure blood flow to the left ventricle, but there's no measurement in humans what the, max coronary blood flow is during maximal activity. There is a estimate value in dogs, which is 100 milliliters per 100 grams per minute. But a lot of times, when you compare animal and human studies, the metabolism is different, physiology is different, so it's hard to make a direct comparison. So again, a short lecture today, but the summary, the main important facts here from this lecture: coronary blood flow is going to be tied to metabolic activity. As the work of the heart, as the cardiac output goes up, so does the blood flow necessary to match that work, right? You need to supply more oxygen to those muscle cells if they're working harder, so they can have the energy to keep up output. And so when, that initial O2 supply to demand ratio is reduced because that diastolic filling time is shortened, well, then you get the release of vasodilators such as nitric oxide, which are going to help vasodilate those coronary arteries and help deliver more blood flow to the cardiac muscle tissue. Coronary O2 extraction is near maximal, even at rest. And so that's what makes the heart flow limited. That's what makes its VO2 flow limited, that the oxygen delivery is going to rely on increases in blood flow. And again, in order to increase blood flow during exercise, we need those vasodilators, right? And that comes out of the mismatch in O2 supply to O2 demand. And then most coronary blood flows occurs during diastole, but since diastole is going to be reduced during exercise due to an increase in heart rate, again, we need to have these backup mechanisms in order to increase cardiac muscle blood flow. Okay, hopefully a pretty short lecture here today. So we're again this whole section discusses exercise and our body's response to it, cardiovascular. So we've talked about the delivery of blood flow to the cardiac muscle tissue and skeletal muscle tissue. But next time we'll talk about what happens to inactive regions of the body, right? Because we have a redistribution of that blood. We're taking it from less active areas and delivering it to more active areas. But those inactive regions, they still have a VO2 demand, right? They still need to carry out functions even when we're exercising. So what's going to happen to those inactive regions to make sure that they're functioning properly during exercise? Thank you guys so much, and I'll see you the next lecture.